And good morning, everybody. David Cross with you again. And today I think we're going to go through a few things with the configuration to pick up where we left off on the DNS appliance. And at this point, we have configured the system. We have a DNS server in place, and we've defined the appliance within IP control so that we can reach the appliance through its IP address defined. And we should confirm that through the reports in the appliance dashboard, and we should be able to see the services that are started and or stopped. And as we just saw, the IP control connection just now came on. I just rebooted my system. So now we have the full appliance. We have it configured, and it should be accessible through IP control. And we can really find out a couple of things real quick without doing anything else. And the first is through the DNS server. Let's take a look at what server options are defined. So very first of all, when we pull up the DNS screen, the first thing we're going to see is the general configuration. That's going to give us the name, the IP address, and some of the default configuration settings for the files and so forth. So this screen should already be populated based on the Sapphire appliance definition. Shouldn't have to do anything here. But the other tabs that you're going to have options to, and we'll have to go through some separate configurations, will be for the logging channels. We do need to go in and set those up prior to defining these. We'll come back to that. There is an option through the named configuration of the servers to provide any type of bind compliant syntax that can be put as plain text within the config file. So if there is an option that we don't support and or something experimental and or something that you have managed externally, you can provide that information in plain text form here. The root hints, we're not going to build this on this particular server, but you can have the root hints if you had your master was going to query the root or your secondaries to the roots. We typically do the DNS server for the root access in a tiered hierarchy. I won't go over that in this video here, but typically you have an internet caching server, then your internal separated by the architecture itself so that your internal external queries are directed where they need to be. And then from as advanced setting up any of the RNDC channels, we do have the default keys that we use and the messaging allowed. And from an option perspective, by default, there are no options defined in the template for the DNS Sapphire. And I'm going to come back to this as we move through some of these other configurations. But what the options here are is for this version of bind, which is bind 911. This is effectively all of the supported server level options within the named config file that are capable of being configured. So there's a few things here, such as the address list, which are access control lists, that we need to define before we can go in and set these values. So I'm just going to show these. We're going to come back and define these in a few moments. And then from a statistics channel, the servers do support the ability to run on a statistics channel. And I'm going to go ahead and just define this. And it's kind of open at this point, but I'll show you what we do with this configuration. Now I have already configured this so that we could, and pushed it so that we could see the configuration here. But the last known good config, every time it actually deploys successfully, it maintains what that configuration file looks like in the database and makes it available that you can then copy paste this information back into a config if you ever had to recreate the server manually. Now there's also, just one area that we would replace the PID file and so on. But aside from that, this should be the entire config file necessary. Now tags is a way of grouping DNS servers together so that if we had common tasks like deploying configurations, dynamic updates, or even operating system or updates along the lines of the binaries, you can group these servers together. So I might be doing, ATL Viha, let's say virtual office ATL. And then we'll just go ahead and do OK. And any other appliances that I want grouped together, when I define them, I would associate them to this tag. And we'll use that from there. So I'm going to go ahead and save this just to show you the configuration. And then what we want to do, just to verify that the server is communicating back to IP control and getting its configuration and so forth, is we're going to go ahead and config deploy this server. So we'll click on the management configuration deployment, select the DNS server, Actually, I jumped ahead of myself here. The config, we'll select a server from the list and or start typing the name and it'll fill in. And the type that we're going to do initially here is all files. It's just a caching server, so we could effectively do just configuration only. And we'll perform the check before we reload the server. We'll stop and reload it back to the known good. We'll store the known good, and we can also set this up on a scheduled interval or on a recurring task, which we typically would if we had other changes. So I just want to submit it. I want to make sure that this task is deployed, that it is being deployed to the server, and that the appliance is communicating. When the tasks go into the queue, the default is not to refresh, but you can go ahead and refresh this, set up the time as well, and or click the refresh to see the status change. And if you click into the task while it's running or operational, there are subtasks. So there's a deployment of the configuration file itself to the executive, and then there's a deployment of that config where the remote appliance pulls that information down, checks it, and then loads it into place. It'll do the name deacon checks to verify the configuration is good, and if everything is successful, we should get a complete task. Now we know that the DNS is operational, we know that it's capable of communicating to the executive, and we can now start building some DNS configuration files and or settings around that additional capabilities. So I wanted to just kind of stop at this video. This has already kind of carried on a little longer, and we'll go from this point forward and start working on setting up some of the IPAM, some of the DNS, the containers, policies, and things that will help us get started with the regular configurations. All right, see you in the next video.